the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 50, Becoming the Threshold. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. In this conversation, we're stepping right into the in-between, not the safe places of certainty, but the thresholds, those edges where clarity dissolves, opposites collide, and we are asked to live without final answers. Every culture has known the threshold. Myths place heroes at the crossroads. Rites of passage suspend the initiation between death of the old self and birth of the new. In psychology, it's called liminality, the strange, disorienting space of not yet. And for some of us, the threshold is not just a temporary passage. It becomes a way of life. To live as an edge walker is to stop waiting for certainty before moving forward. It's learning to dwell in paradox, to feel both fear and courage, both belonging and exile, both grief and gratitude. It is to accept that transformation doesn't come after the tension resolves, but through staying inside it long enough for it to reshape us. I've known moments like this in my own life. Times where I didn't feel at home in any of the roles handed to me, where I stood on the edge of belonging yet couldn't quite step away either. At first it felt like exile, but over time I realized it was also initiation. The edge itself was teaching me, sharpening perception, loosening certainty, and showing me that aliveness comes not from clinging to one truth, but from being able to hold many at once. In this episode, we'll explore what it means to become the threshold itself, to stop treating liminality as something to endure briefly and instead embrace it as a way of living. We'll draw on anthropology, psychology, and personal reflection to see how paradox, ambiguity, and uncertainty can become sources of radical presence, because perhaps the task is not to escape the edge, but to learn how to walk it with courage, curiosity, and the kind of wholeness only the in-between can teach. Let's begin. Walking the edge. There are people who live inside certainty. Their days are patterned, their roles clear, their identities anchored in familiar structures. Safety, predictability, and belonging form their coordinates. But some of us, by choice or by force, end up elsewhere. We become edge walkers. The life between worlds. To live on the threshold is to live in paradox. You are neither fully inside the old world nor fully claimed by the new. You carry fragments of both. There is disorientation, yes, but also a kind of radical aliveness. At the edge, nothing is automatic. Every choice feels heightened, every step carries weight, because you know how fragile it all is. Edge walkers have appeared in every culture. Shamans who straddled spirit and body, prophets who lived outside their people before returning with vision, exiles and migrants navigating the space between homelands. In modern life, edge walking might look less dramatic, but the essence is the same: standing in uncertainty, refusing easy answers, learning to breathe in paradox. Threshold living is not glamorous. It is messy, confusing, and often lonely. But it also offers something the center cannot: a way of seeing, a way of living that honors both fragility and possibility. Attributes of edge walking paradox: living in contradictions without forcing resolution. Uncertainty, embracing the unknown as ground, not enemy. Awareness, heightened perception, since survival requires it. Isolation, stepping outside the familiar means, leaving some belonging behind. Vision, perspective sharpened by living at the edge of stability. Themes, the threshold as life living between identities. Illness, migration, divorce, career change, all can push us into threshold states where old roles dissolve and new ones are not yet solid. The spiritual edge. Mystics speak of liminality as both darkness and clarity. The dark night of the soul isn't just suffering, it's the threshold where ego dissolves and deeper presence emerges. Creativity at the margins. Many artists, thinkers, and innovators dwell at the edges of cultural consensus. To create is to risk standing outside, seeing what the center cannot. The fragility of belonging. Living on thresholds often means losing old communities without yet finding new ones. But it also allows for belonging on different terms: chosen, conscious, awake. Personal reflection. I think back to times when life itself pushed me into thresholds. One of the clearest was during my health breakdowns, the diabetes diagnosis, the migraine episodes. Before those moments, I had lived with an illusion of stability. My body worked, my mind carried me through. I assumed I could always push further if I had to. But when the body collapsed, I was thrust into a new kind of edge, Not death exactly, but not the old life either. I remember one evening in particular, after yet another migraine that left me flattened for days. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, caught between fear of what was happening and a strange awareness that something in me was changing. I wasn't just losing health, I was losing the identity I had built around being dependable, productive, strong. In its place, something raw emerged, a deeper awareness of fragility, but also of presence. That edge wasn't comfortable. I felt suspended, no longer who I had been, not yet sure who I was becoming. But looking back, I can see that this liminal state was itself the teacher. It stripped me of certainty and control, and in the cracks, vision began to seep through. I learned to live without guarantees. I learned to hold paradoxes, both broken and alive, both afraid and awake. Psychological insight. Thresholds as psychological fire psychology has often struggled with thresholds because they are messy, hard to categorize, and refuse neat outcomes. But some thinkers have tried to name what happens when the self is stretched at the edges of identity. Arnold van Gennep and later Victor Turner described liminality in Ritual. Initiates leave the old world, pass through ordeal, and emerge differently. But Turner noted something profound in liminality. The old identity is dissolved, but the new one is not yet formed. This in-between is terrifying because it feels like groundlessness. Yet it is precisely this disorientation that makes transformation possible. In more modern terms, psychologists talk about identity moratorium, Erickson, seasons when identity is suspended, uncertain, unsettled. For some, this is adolescence. For others, it returns in crises, illness, divorce, career shifts. In moratorium, old roles no longer fit, but new ones aren't ready. Many people panic here, trying to rush back to stability. But those who stay often discover deeper authenticity. I've felt this firsthand. After my diabetes diagnosis, I could no longer cling to the illusion of invincibility. I wasn't yet the new me, someone who respected limits, adjusted diet, changed pace. I was suspended between denial and adaptation. The temptation was to cling to the past, to pretend nothing had changed. But the longer I resisted, the worse the collapse became. It was only when I surrendered to the threshold, admitting I was neither who I had been nor yet who I would become, that growth began. Psychologists studying resilience confirm this paradox. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun's work on post-traumatic growth shows that crises often provoke a shattering of assumptions. We lose the scaffolding of identity, meaning, and security. But it is in this void that deeper growth occurs, new priorities, new values, sometimes new selves. The very disorientation that feels unbearable is the fire that burns away illusions. Living as an edge walker, then, is less about seeking extremes and more about learning to inhabit this liminal psychology. It is the ability to stay in suspension, to resist premature closure, to breathe through paradoxes until a deeper truth forms. This isn't abstract to me, it is lived. On the nights I lay in the dark after migraines, uncertain if my body was failing beyond repair, I wasn't just suffering, I was being reoriented. Pain stripped away my identity as provider, invincible worker, dependable presence. And in the silence, I heard another truth whispering, "You are not your productivity, you are not your certainty. You are more fragile and more alive than that." Embodiment prompt or practice. This week, choose one threshold in your own life. It might be illness, transition, uncertainty in work, or even an unresolved decision. Instead of trying to force resolution, sit with it. Name the paradox you are living. Write it down in 2 sentences. I am no longer this, but not yet that. Spend time with the discomfort. Notice how your body reacts. Breathe into the tension without trying to fix it. This is edge walking in practice. Integration moment. The edge is rarely comfortable. It strips us of guarantees, dismantles old selves, and leaves us suspended in a space that feels unbearable. But the edge is also where aliveness intensifies. To live as an edge walker is to accept paradox as ground, to embrace uncertainty as teacher, and to discover that thresholds are not empty, they are wombs of becoming. Seed to plant. Next time you feel suspended between what was and what is not yet, resist the urge to escape. Whisper instead. This threshold is not failure, it is initiation. Dwelling in paradox, to walk the threshold is to live inside contradiction. We want certainty, yet we are drawn to mystery. We long for belonging, yet crave independence. We fear death, yet hunger for transcendence. Most of the time, culture encourages us to resolve these opposites, pick one side, suppress the tension, and simplify the story. But to live as a threshold self is to do the opposite, to dwell in paradox without rushing to closure. Holding contradictions without collapse paradox is uncomfortable. It stretches the psyche in two directions at once, but it is also fertile. Many of the greatest insights in philosophy, spirituality, even science, have emerged not from clear answers, but from the willingness to stay in the question. At the edge, paradox is no longer an intellectual puzzle. It is the texture of life. Attributes of dwelling in paradox tension, holding opposites without resolving them prematurely, ambiguity, comfort with uncertainty, creativity, new forms emerge only when opposites are allowed to interact. Patience, paradox unfolds slowly, resisting quick solutions. Wholeness, integration happens not by erasing difference, but by carrying it. Themes, the fertility of contradiction mystics and paradox. From Meister Eckhart's darkness brighter than light to Zen koans that refuse rational closure, spiritual traditions have long used paradox to break open awareness. Psychological integration. Jung described individuation as the uniting of opposites, masculine and feminine, shadow and light, conscious and unconscious. To become whole is not to erase conflict, but to embrace it. Everyday paradoxes. Parenting is both joy and exhaustion. Love is both intimacy and risk. Work can be both meaningful and draining. Threshold living sharpens our awareness that paradox is everywhere, not just in mystical texts. Creativity at the edge. Writers, artists, and thinkers often dwell in paradox, using the clash of opposites as fuel for imagination. Creativity rarely arises from comfort. It thrives where contradictions grind against each other. Personal reflection. I've often wrestled with paradoxes in my own life. One of the clearest came during the years when my health broke down. Diabetes demanded discipline, monitoring food, regulating energy, structuring life carefully. But at the same time, the migraines forced surrender. I couldn't control when they came, I couldn't push through with sheer willpower. I had to yield to the collapse. On the surface, these two conditions pulled in opposite directions. One required strict control, the other demanded radical acceptance. For a long time I felt torn. Was I supposed to master my body or surrender to it? Was I weak for collapsing or wise for letting go? The paradox nearly broke me. But slowly I began to see that the tension itself was the lesson. Control and surrender were not enemies. They were both truths, both needed, both part of what it meant to live honestly in my body. To cling only to control would have made me brittle. To collapse only into surrender would have left me powerless. The paradox was painful, but it was also the place of balance, the threshold where wholeness began to form. Psychological insight, paradox as catalyst for growth psychology, has increasingly recognized that paradox is not just a philosophical curiosity, it is a psychological crucible. Carl Jung argued that the psyche thrives not by eliminating opposites, but by holding them in tension until something new emerges. He called this the transcendent function, the capacity of the mind to generate new possibilities by refusing premature resolution. For Jung, wholeness always came through paradox, the union of shadow and self, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious. Contemporary research on dialectical thinking echoes this. Psychologists like Peng and Nisbet, 1999, showed that cultures shaped by Eastern philosophies often accept contradiction as natural, whereas Western cultures tend to resolve it quickly. But those who can tolerate paradox often report higher resilience, creativity, and adaptability. I've seen this in myself. The paradox of control and surrender in my health crises forced me to grow in ways neither side alone could teach. Control taught me responsibility, attention, and discipline. Surrender taught me humility, patience, and compassion for my limits. The threshold wasn't about choosing one or the other. It was about learning to live in both at once. This echoes what Viktor Frankl described in his work on meaning-making under extreme conditions, that suffering and hope, despair and purpose can coexist. Meaning is not found by erasing contradiction, but by bearing it. Living as an edgewalker means taking paradox seriously, not as something to be solved, but as something to be lived. It means recognizing that we can be fragile and strong, broken and whole, afraid and brave, often in the same breath. Embodiment prompt or practice: think of one paradox you are currently living, perhaps in your work, your relationships, or your inner life. Write it in a single sentence beginning with "I am both," or "I want both." Sit with it. Resist the urge to solve it. Instead, breathe into the discomfort. Notice what possibilities arise when you allow both sides to exist together. Integration moment paradox stretches us, often painfully, but it also enlarges us. It refuses the smallness of single answers and forces us into a bigger self, one that can carry contradictions without collapse. Seed to plant. Next time you feel torn between opposites, don't rush to decide. Pause and whisper, maybe both are true. Maybe the threshold is not choosing, but living in between. The dance with death. To live as a threshold walker is to live close to death. Not always literally, but always symbolically. Mortality shadows every risk, every ordeal, every brush with fragility. And yet, paradoxically, those moments when death feels near often become the most vivid moments of life. Mortality at the edge. The dance with death is not about courting destruction recklessly. It is about recognizing that to be alive is to be mortal, and that awareness, far from paralyzing us, can become the very fuel for presence, courage, and clarity. Attributes of the dance with death: mortality, the constant reminder that life has an end. Courage, not the absence of fear, but moving through it. Ecstasy, the heightened aliveness born from proximity to loss. Clarity, the stripping away of the trivial when faced with fragility. Themes: facing mortality, finding meaning near death encounters. Those who survive accidents or illnesses often describe the world as sharper, relationships as more precious, and priorities as utterly rearranged. Extreme sports and mortality. Psychologists studying climbers, divers, or wingsuit flyers find that the attraction is not death itself, but the intensity of living close to it. Mortality and spiritual practice. From Tibetan Buddhism's meditations on death to the Stoic practice of memento mori, cultures have long used mortality as a mirror for life. Threshold awareness. To dance with death is to accept its presence, not to deny it. It is to let mortality shape the choices we make, not in despair, but in clarity. Personal reflection. There have been moments in my life where mortality wasn't abstract, it was close enough to feel. One of the starkest came not in a dramatic accident, but in the silent collapse of my own body during a migraine attack. The pain was overwhelming, light stabbed, noise crushed, movement was impossible. But worse than the pain was the sensation that my body was shutting down. Lying there, barely able to lift my head, I felt as though I was slipping out of life itself. At one point, I remember thinking, is this what dying feels like? The fear was raw, but there was also a strange stillness that accompanied it. When the migraine passed, I didn't bounce back the same. Something had shifted. Life felt more fragile, but also more vivid. The ordinary, a walk outside, laughter with someone close, even the first sip of water after the nausea, felt sharper, almost sacred. Mortality had brushed me, and in its shadow I saw life more clearly. Psychological insight, mortality, or an aliveness psychological research, suggests that awareness of death, what Ernest Becker called mortality salience, can shape us in radically different ways. For some, it produces fear, denial, or a desperate clinging to control. But for others, it becomes a catalyst for deeper living. Studies in terror management theory, Greenberg, Solomon, and Pajitsky, 1997, show that when mortality is confronted directly, people often reorient their values, seeking meaning, intimacy, and authenticity over status or distraction. It's not the thought of death itself that matters, but whether we allow it to deepen or diminish us. Research into awe experiences, Keltner and Haidt, 2003, shows that encounters with vastness, a mountain peak, a violent storm, or even a brush with death, dissolve the small self and create a sense of connection to something larger. Death awareness, paradoxically, can open us to awe and humility, sharpening aliveness. In my own experience, those migraines became uninvited mortality meditations. Each collapse reminded me that the body is temporary, that life is fragile, that control is an illusion. But instead of pushing me into despair, they seeded a kind of clarity. I realized how easily life can be taken, and that truth reshaped how I wanted to spend my time. where I wanted to invest energy, and who I wanted beside me. The dance with death taught me that fragility is not something to hide from. It is the very condition that makes life precious. Embodiment prompt or practice. Take 10 minutes to sit quietly and imagine. If today were your last day, what would matter? Write down three things. 1. What you would let go of. 2. Who or what you would turn toward. 3. What you would want to say or do before the end. Notice how this simple brush with mortality reshapes your sense of priority. Integration moment. The dance with death is unsettling. It strips us of illusions, confronts us with fragility, and asks us to face endings we cannot avoid. But in that confrontation, something awakens, a fiercer gratitude, a deeper clarity, a sharper love for the fragile moments we do have. Seed to plant. This week, instead of denying mortality, let it guide one choice. Ask yourself, if I only had a short time, what would I choose differently? Then live a little closer to that truth. Personal encounters with sacred risk. It's one thing to study risk in theory, in culture, or in ritual. It's another to live it in your own body. Sacred risk isn't only in mountaineering or skydiving. It can appear in the ordinary, when life asks you to step past safety into the unknown. These encounters test not just our courage, but our relationship with ourselves. When risk becomes personal risk, feels different when it's lived. The adrenaline spikes, the body trembles, doubt rises, and a choice presents itself: retreat or cross the threshold. In that moment, we learn more about ourselves than in months of reflection. Attributes of personal risk: adrenaline, the body's primal surge before stepping forward. Fragility, the sudden awareness of how easily things could break. Learning, the lessons carried only by experience, never by theory. Humility, the recognition that risk doesn't guarantee victory. Resilience, the ability to step forward even after stumbling. Themes: everyday thresholds of risk in the body, training endurance and pushing beyond old limits. Risk in relationships, vulnerability as a kind of sacred danger, the courage to be seen or rejected. Risk in change, leaving a job, moving cities, or starting over, the leap from familiar to unknown. Risk in expression, speaking an unpopular truth, sharing art, or choosing authenticity over approval. Sacred risk appears in all of these. It is not always dramatic, but it is always transformative. Personal reflection. For me, one of the clearest encounters with sacred risk came through long distance running. When I began, I couldn't even jog 30 meters without stopping, breathless and doubting myself. But day after day, I pushed further, from half a mile to a few miles, to mornings where the minimum became 13 miles, and eventually into cross country and hill training. The greatest threshold wasn't physical, it was mental. There were mornings when my body screamed to stop, when critics around me muttered that I'd never complete the London Marathon. But each step past that limit silenced those voices, both theirs and my own. Crossing the finish line of training runs, drenched in sweat, exhausted, and yet more alive than ever, taught me something deeper. Risk isn't only about danger of death, it's about danger of failure. And yet, in walking or running into that danger, I discovered confidence, resilience, and a sense of belonging to myself that no one could take away. Risk in that sense became sacred. It was a fire that burned away doubt and revealed strength I hadn't known was there. Psychological insight. Risk as personal threshold psychology frames personal encounters with risk as crucibles where identity is reshaped. Studies in self-efficacy, Bandura, 1977, show that each time we successfully face a challenge, our belief in our own capacity grows. This isn't abstract, it's embodied. The runner who pushes through another mile, the speaker who survives the tremor of public words, the patient who endures treatment, each carries proof that risk can be met. Research into growth mindset, Dweck, 2006, echoes this. Failure in risk is not the end, it is information. Those who frame setbacks as learning rather than defeat develop resilience that outlasts immediate outcomes. At the same time, fear conditioning studies reveal that avoidance strengthens fear, while exposure, carefully chosen, deliberate, reduces it. Risk, then, is a training ground for the psyche. The body shakes, but stepping forward rewrites the script. I can survive this. In my own running, this became clear. The first time I pushed through pain instead of stopping, I learned something about myself. Not that I was invincible, but that I was capable of more than I imagined. That lesson didn't just shape my running, it bled into how I approached work, relationships, and life. Risk taught me that self-trust is built at the edge of failure. Embodiment prompt or practice this week. Choose one small risk you've been avoiding, a conversation, a challenge, a step forward. Notice the fear that rises before you act. Step through anyway. Afterwards, write down, what did I fear? What did I learn? Sacred risk is not only about the grand gesture, it's about these everyday edges where we reclaim life. Integration moment, personal encounters with risk remind us that transformation is not abstract. It lived, sweated, trembled, and endured. Each threshold crossed becomes a seed of resilience, proof that we can survive more than we thought. Seed to plant. This week, ask yourself, where am I avoiding a risk because of fear? Take one small step toward it, not recklessly, but consciously. Risk, when met with awareness, becomes initiation. Psychological insights, risk and the psyche. When we talk about risk, we often picture cliffs, fire, or danger from the outside, but the most profound dimension of risk unfolds within. Every external leap is mirrored by an internal confrontation, with fear, with mortality, with uncertainty, and with the fragile belief in our own capacity. The inner landscape of risk psychology helps us understand why risk is so potent, not because it always threatens our lives, but because it threatens the stories we live by. Risk cracks the self wide open. It reveals how identity is bound to fear, how courage is cultivated, and how growth emerges from dancing with the unknown. Attributes of the psyche in risk anxiety. Risk activates the nervous system, heightening vigilance and narrowing focus. Courage, not the absence of fear, but action in its presence. Transcendence, the moments where risk lifts us beyond ordinary consciousness. Growth, the reshaping of identity through the ordeal. Surrender, acceptance that outcome is never fully under control. Themes, psychological theories of risk sensation seeking. Marvin Zuckerman, 1994. Zuckerman's work describes sensation seeking as a trait. Some individuals are wired to crave intensity, novelty, and risk. For them, risk isn't pathology but a path to aliveness. Long distance running, skydiving, mountain climbing, all can be expressions of this drive. Flow states. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, 1990, Psychology of Flow, reveals that risk often propels us into altered states of consciousness. When challenge perfectly balances skill, fear transforms into focus, and time dissolves. Many athletes and adventurers describe this state as spiritual, a merging of body, mind, and environment. Mortality awareness, Ernest Becker, 1973. Terror management theory. Research into mortality salience shows that reminders of death, which risk always carries, shape human behavior profoundly. We cling tighter to cultural values, but we can also awaken to more authentic living. Risk sharpens life because it brushes us against death. Communal belonging and risk. Recent studies in social psychology show that shared risk forges powerful bonds. Soldiers in combat, climbers on the same rope, activists in protest. The danger endured together dissolves ego and builds trust. Communitas, as Victor Turner called it, is not born in comfort, but in shared fire. Personal reflection. Living psychology in the flesh. I didn't find these theories first in books. I found them in my own body. When I trained for long distance runs, I discovered sensation seeking in myself, though I wouldn't have called it that then. There was something addictive about the edge, the way fear of collapse mixed with exhilaration as I pushed past old limits. Flow was familiar too. Somewhere after mile 10, the chatter of doubt would dissolve, replaced by rhythm, breath, and a sense of being carried by something larger. Risk wasn't just endured, it became a kind of prayer. And mortality awareness that came less from running and more from migraines and illness. Each attack, each diagnosis reminded me that the body is fragile, that collapse is always near. But instead of paralyzing me, it sharpened my choices. Life wasn't abstract anymore, it was immediate. Risk reminded me, you don't have forever. Finally, there was a belonging. During training sessions with others or moments of shared difficulty in work or life, I felt the truth of this research. Risk bonds. To endure fire together is to trust in ways comfort never teaches. Psychological insight woven together. When we step into risk, we are not just playing with danger, we are reprogramming the psyche. Sensation seeking pushes us toward novelty. Flow lifts us into transcendence. Mortality awareness strips away illusions of permanence. Communal belonging reminds us we are never alone at the edge. Risk, then, is not random thrill seeking. It is an initiatory practice, a psychological crucible that sharpens perception, rewrites identity, and binds us into deeper communion with both life and each other. Embodiment prompt or practice: choose one moment of risk you have lived, physical, emotional, or existential. Write down what fear rose, what strength appeared in response, what meaning did you carry out of it. Notice how risk reshaped not only your circumstances, but your psyche itself. Integration moment psychology shows us what the body already knows. Risk is never just danger, it is the threshold. Every encounter with risk is a rehearsal for death, a practice in courage, a portal into flow, and a path into belonging. Seed to plant. The next time you face risk, whether in the body, in love, or in truth telling, pause and remember this is not just fear, this is initiation. Living with sacred risk doesn't always arrive as a dramatic leap. It's not only in cliffs, marathons, or lightning strike ordeals. Sometimes it shows up in quieter choices, speaking truth when silence would be safer, loving when rejection is possible, leaving a path that no longer fits even when the next step isn't clear. Carrying risk into daily life. To live with sacred risk is to stop waiting for safety. It is to carry the awareness that life itself is uncertain, and to meet that uncertainty as teacher, not enemy. Risk as daily spiritual discipline. Living with sacred risk means reframing ordinary life. Choosing truth over comfort, saying what matters, even if it unsettles. Choosing growth over safety, leaning into challenges rather than avoiding them. Choosing presence over illusion, remembering that tomorrow is not guaranteed, so the risk of love, creativity, or authenticity belongs to today. In this way, risk becomes not just a momentary ordeal, but a rhythm of aliveness. Personal reflection, walking daily with risk. For me, living with risk has rarely been about thrill seeking. It's been about decisions that demanded vulnerability. When I changed my diet after diabetes, it wasn't just about health, it was about risking failure, risking the loss of habits I leaned on, risking the unknown of what life would look like on the other side. That was a risk lived daily, in every meal, in every choice. The migraines, too, taught me this. I had to risk slowing down, risk stepping back from responsibilities I once defined myself by. For someone who prided himself on reliability and endurance, that surrender felt dangerous. But living with sacred risk meant accepting that to keep pushing would do more harm than good. And beyond health, risk has shown itself in conversations, in relationships, in projects like this very work, speaking about the shadow emotions, about fragility, about truths that don't fit neatly into polite culture. Every episode is itself a risk. Will it connect? Will it provoke? Will it be misunderstood? But without that risk, the work would be hollow. Living risk has taught me that the edge is not only where we test our limits, it is where life becomes most alive. Psychological insight. Choosing growth over safety. Psychologists have long observed that risk is central to development. Abraham Maslow wrote that in every moment we face a choice, move toward safety or toward growth. Growth always feels riskier because it means leaving the familiar behind. Contemporary research on existential psychology echoes this. Rollo May described courage not as fearlessness, but as the willingness to step into uncertainty for the sake of becoming. Without that step, aliveness shrinks. Even studies on positive risk-taking in mental health, Sevigny and Lautzenheiser, 2010, show that carefully chosen risks, whether trying something new in therapy or speaking honestly in relationships, are often what unlocks transformation. Risk, in other words, is not recklessness. It is the willingness to be vulnerable to the unknown. Looking back, the risks that shaped me most were not about physical danger, but about allowing myself to be redefined, to risk change in body, identity, and purpose, to risk being seen in ways that felt unsafe. And each time, though fear never left, what I carried out of the fire was not just survival, but a deeper sense of who I was. Embodiment, prompt, or practice. This week, identify one place in your life where you've been avoiding risk, not reckless risk, but the sacred kind. Is it a conversation you've been postponing? A creative project you've been resisting? A habit you know is harming you, but fear letting go of? Choose one small step into that risk. Write down what you fear losing and what you hope might be gained. Then take the step not to banish fear, but to move with it. Integration moment. To live with sacred risk is to live awake. It is to let fear and fragility remind us of the preciousness of life. It is to remember that safety was never the real goal, aliveness was. Seed to plant. This week, when faced with a choice, ask, am I choosing safety or growth? Then listen. Growth will always feel like a risk, but it is also where life waits. Becoming the threshold to live as a threshold is to stop pretending life is ever certain. It is to accept that we are always between what has been and what is yet to come, always walking the edge between safety and surrender. Sacred risk is not about chasing danger, it is about daring to be fully alive, even when the ground beneath us shakes. Paradox, uncertainty, fragility, these are not enemies. They are invitations to risk truth over silence, to risk love over withdrawal, to risk presence over numbness. And in those choices, life sharpens, becomes vivid, becomes real. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and remember, life is not found in safety, but at the edges we dare to walk. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.